Hi everyone, I hope my audio is okay. But welcome to the webinar. Just as John said, we're really glad that everyone can join us today. I work for the Arizona Developmental Disabilities Planning Council, and we're partnering with the Phoenix Mayor's Commission on Disability Issues to bring you this webinar on crisis intervention for community organizations. This presentation really is a follow-up to an April public forum that was hosted by the MCDI here in Phoenix. And a lot of people attended. A lot of our panelists had great comments regarding crisis intervention from the traditional standpoint of law enforcement and some other agencies. We also heard from a self-advocate there. But now we're taking a different tact. We understand many people are working in nonprofits or community centers, and maybe they simply don't know how to react when one of their clients or guests has a mental health crisis. So that's what we're here to talk about today. And we've gathered some great experts to answer your questions and present their expertise on the topic. So I'm going to do a quick run through of everyone's bio, and we're going to start with Christian Johnston, our first presenter. Christian is the chairwoman of the Mayor's Commission on Disability Issues, and she also has her own consulting business, Holistic Counseling and Wellness Alternatives. She founded that more than 10 years ago. Christian is a nationally recognized trainer, consultant, speaker, and community organizer. She received her master's degree from Columbia University and her MBA from the University of Phoenix. We're really excited to have her join us today. Next, we will hear from Ray Morris. Ray is one of our council members here at the ADDPC, and he's also the founder of Dads for Special Kids, a nonprofit that supports families of parents of kids with special needs. He's also a retired firefighter, but he stays busy now as an advisor to FEMA when they are dealing with natural disasters around the country. He helps them support families and individuals with disabilities. Finally, we're going to hear from Frank O'Halloran. Frank has been the Crisis Services Liaison for Mercy Maricopa since April 2015. He has a background in law enforcement and extensive experience in working within the existing crisis system in Maricopa County for nearly 30 years. A lot of that experience comes from his 25-year career with the Scottsdale Police, where he worked as a SWAT crisis negotiator and CIT trainer. And he continues to do a lot of trainings in this crisis realm around the county. We're going to end with some questions from you all, our audience. Please type your questions in the chat box once we hear the presentations from everybody, and we're going to get those questions answered for you. Just remember, this is being recorded. We want you all to be able to share this with your friends and colleagues and to watch it again if you wish. So I'm going to hand things off over to you now, Christian, and thanks again everyone for joining us.
Hold on, Christian. The audio, can't hear you yet. If you can activate your audio.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Well, thank you. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Christian Johnston Nunez, and I'm the chair of the Mayor's Commission on Disability Issues. I will also be talking with you briefly about the warning signs of a crisis. Are you all able to see me? Okay, perfect. Okay, we had a little webcam issues going on there. Okay, to start off, I would like to just kind of give a basic definition of what a mental health crisis is. So according to the Mental Health Crisis Response Institute, a mental health crisis is when a person is dealing with mental health issues or issues in their life that they are unable to cope with everyday life stressors. So it's really important to understand that anything can be everyday life stressor. That can be ranging from work activities, not managing work, not managing school, not managing your home responsibilities, being overwhelmed and not performing your activities of daily living, which consider brushing your teeth, washing, combing your hair, eating, etc. One of the most important things to recognize, though, is there's a difference between a mental health emergency and a mental health crisis. First, just briefly saying a mental health emergency is when a person is making behaviors and actions that are either threatening their life, suicide, threatening other people, making physical actions, which would be homicidal actions or threats, or aggressive assault threats. And the behavior is so bizarre and unorganized that they cannot, it's a fear for their safety or the safety of others. In those cases, the mental health emergency, and typically you would need to call 911 in that situation. Now, in regards to mental health crisis, a mental health crisis is sort of the same behavior. So basically we know a person will be difficult and having a hard time coping with their daily life responsibilities. They're having a hard time coping with their emotions. They're having a hard time managing just getting up every day in some ways. It's also really important to understand that when a person has a mental health crisis, they don't necessarily need to have a mental health diagnosis. And they sometimes don't have a mental health diagnosis. Anyone can have a mental health crisis. When they experience any of those things where they're not functioning at their best capabilities and their normal capabilities for them, then that would be some indications that they're going into mental health crisis. So I'm going to identify some warning signs to look for when we are looking to see if a person we know is experiencing a mental health crisis. I do want you all to keep in mind that we're not trying to make diagnoses here, but we're definitely just looking for behaviors that seem outside of that person's normal or seem where they can become threatening or a risk to other people around them. Okay. So the first thing that we notice when a person's experiencing a mental health crisis, a warning sign, is the person's behavior becomes changed. It's an unexpected change. So it's not their typical, I'm in a bad mood today, I'm having stress. It's a major, drastic, unexpected change that occurs in a behavior that's noticeable to others around them. It may be noticeable to them, but it definitely is going to be noticeable to people around them. The second thing that may occur is they become very easily agitated, very restless, easily agitated, and you see this in their body language as well as their words. So if you pay attention to the body language of the person, you may notice that they're just really hyper agitated, moving around restlessly, making motions and things like that. It just may seem out of place with the current situation and timing. Another thing that may occur is they may have racing thoughts and talking excessively fast. Not just our normal super talkers, but excessively fast, where it's hard to understand them. Their thoughts can be a little bit jumbled or disorganized, and it's just they're jumping from tangential thoughts from one thing to the next. When we see this occur, it says to us that something's different and something's going on that's not for this person's normal behavior. The person may also be out of touch with reality. They may make statements or comments that just don't seem in the right place in the right time, or don't seem like they're really demonstrating reality in that point. When we see that, it may be very bizarre statements. And those can range from anything regarding delusions of their worth, their ability, to fears, paranoia. These thoughts can range in motion in all different ways. And when we see these things, we know that there's something going on with that person that's different from normal. And that's the most important thing we want to pay attention to. We're recognizing that this person that we're experiencing in our lives, in our community, is having a major shift and change in their behavior to where they're not functioning at their best capability and their normal capability for them. And most importantly, one of the things that we know for sure is a warning sign for mental health crisis is when that person is unable to be calmed down. So interventions, talking to the person, speaking to them, you're having a very difficult time getting them to calm. They're having a hard time self-regulating themselves in their behavior, or have a hard time identifying that their behavior needs to be regulated. So these are some basic things that we notice when a person is experiencing a mental health crisis and some warning signs. And as we go through this webinar, you'll get some demonstrations and ideas of other things that are coming on and some tips on how to address the person that you feel may be experiencing a mental health crisis. And that's all I have, and I'm going to turn it over to Frank. Thank you.
One moment, folks. A little bit of technical difficulty here. Next up will be Ray Morris. Let me grab. Ray, would you mind clicking on the arrows down at the bottom? We can advance to your slide there. Thank you very much. I think we should be good to go.
Ready to go? Okay. Hi, my name is Ray Morris. As I was stated earlier, I retired from the Scottsdale Fire Department last June. I have an organization called Dads for Special Kids. I've been married for maybe 31 years this month or June. So, and it's been a great experience. My wife is a therapist, counselor. So she specializes in families that have children or an adult with a disability. And so she's been practicing on me for 30 years. So she's got a lot of good skill sets. So you see on the picture there, that's a picture of my son, Zachary. Zachary will be 29 actually this month, June. He has autism and severe cognitive delay. And Zachary's nonverbal, has grand mal seizures. The best thing about Zachary is he has a neat perspective of life and very, I'll say in ways, simple. But he's very loving and has had, we'll call them meltdowns out in the public. And it's very interesting to be a parent of an individual that has goes into crisis in the public, and then on the other side be a first responder being called for assistance for individuals having a crisis in public, even in private at home. So I'm going to be drawing upon those experiences. And first of all, I just want to start out with this is what Center of Disease Control classifies. You know, developmental disabilities cause individuals living with them may have difficulties in certain areas of life, especially language, mobility, learning, self-help, and independent living. And to some extent, we all have those issues, and we all have our own coping mechanisms of how we maintain our homeostasis in life. And when stressors rise up, it causes us to go into use our coping skills to try to maintain our homeostasis. But every individual has a different level. So thinking about those things, everyone exhibits behavior, good or bad, and that behavior is dependent upon the culture of those individuals. For example, if you were to go to overseas, go to say South Africa, and you were to go to a community down there, some of your behavior, what's typical here in this community, may not be acceptable in that community. So there's a norm. So being with individuals with developmental disabilities, they have their norms, their normal behaviors. Zachary has his normal behaviors. An outsider looking in may construe those behaviors to be aggressive or to be bad or, you know, not effective. But Zachary's learning. Zachary, we just transitioned him to living in an adult developmental home last year. We just hit our 1-year anniversary with him moving out. Zachary has a whole new set of behaviors that he exerts in that arena with his day program and at the adult developmental home. to the extent Zachary goes to Arena Rattler football games in that environment, he would never do that with us at our home. And we could never get him to go to a baseball game because that wasn't part of his norm. So we have to look at the norms for that individual and that community and that culture. And just like each of you have your homes, you have families, and there's norms within your family and in your household that are different from other people, be they good or bad. So all behavior is a communication. People are expressing themselves. There's the sender, there's the receiver, and we all send messages differently and receive. For those that are married or have a long-term relationship with an individual, you know what happens. I know for myself, I could tell my wife something, say something to, for example, say, hey, I love you. And she could hear in my tone or whatever, she doesn't hear I love you. She can hear I'm not happy with you. And that becomes the environment of who's sending the message, how we're sending it, and the receiver state of how they're interpreting that message. So it's very crucial to think about those things, especially when you're with somebody that has a developmental disability or an intellectual disability. Their communication forms may be different than yours, so you got to make sure you speak their language so you can convey the message that you're sending, but also what's the message that they're sending. You know, they have like go out in the public with Zachary, he has a meltdown in public, he's communicating something that's frustrated and his coping mechanisms aren't working. Sorry. And we tend to judge people by their behaviors, and it's based upon our own opinions and our own perspectives and views, and that can become a barrier to effective communication and working with people with developmental disability, intellectual disabilities. So we have to look at those kind of things. Their mood, how they're expressing it, their body language, what are they saying? And we all do that with our own body language. When we get upset, frustrated, sometimes we'll lean in or we'll flare up our chest. You know, my wife will sometimes ask me, why are you mad? And I'm like, I'm not mad. She goes, but you all of a sudden got loud. And I'm like, well, I'm passionate about something. I'm expressing that. So need to be concerned with those things. You know, and then also the last one, you know, is does the behavior line up with the social norms of that individual and that community? So we need to be aware of those kind of things. So, you know, through our behaviors, we're expressing how we feel. Okay, so I use this example with my wife, especially when we first got married 31 years ago. She has her PhD in emotional expression. Okay, she can articulate her emotions very well. Well, I was in preschool. You know, I would use the term, hey, I love you. And she would, and I was conveying a lot of emotion in that, saying that. Well, with her, it was, I love you, and then she would go into a little dissertation of why she loves me. And I've had to learn and grow in my expression as she's had to learn to accept my level of expression, and that I am growing and improving in my expression as her as a receiver of the message, lowering her expectation and to line up with mine. So those are things that are learned. And this could also be on the negative side, too, of behavior. Somebody starts throwing objects and to express themselves. And if that's not curved or guided to correction of the correct behavior we want, that can become the norm. And there's nothing wrong with doing that. So those are some things to consider. And a person that's seeking attention is most likely using the inappropriate behavior to get something, and they're going to get more immediate response. Just, you guys know, you get mad and angry, boom, you get a quick response. If you're not, you know, we don't express anger, frustration, but sometimes the message isn't received as quickly as what we're trying to get. So that's why a lot of times people will yell, because they're trying to express something to get attention quicker. So we need to, when we're working with people or in environments with behavior that we're trying to modify to say, is respond quickly to the appropriate behavior to reinforce it to get the response you want. You know, another example of that would be with, you know, with me and my wife and our relationship is I show emotion to her in her language and the way she wants to, and she gives me quick positive reinforcement, I'm gonna respond quicker. Just like, simple analogy, training a puppy. You know, puppies love attention and respond quickly to praise, as also with negative. So stop and listen to what the behavior is telling you. You know, what's their behavior expressing? You know, what is, you know, and a lot of this comes, you get as a first responder, you're trying to do a quick real assessment real quick, but if you're around these individuals, like I'm with Zachary a lot, I learn his culture and I learn his behaviors and what he's saying, and with time we improve that communication. Don't criticize the behavior. Don't demean them, because that's a negative. You know, we want to do things positive behavior. All right. If they do something that's inappropriate, just respond to that. You're upset with the behavior, not the individual. It's the behavior we're trying to, you know, make appropriate. And trigger points. You know, we all have coping mechanisms. They work to a certain point, and then we go into our coping mechanisms. So understand that they've exhausted their coping mechanisms, and they're entering a crisis in some of their behavior. So respond calmly to them, you know, and try to redirect. Redirect's one of the best things that I've personally used in the field as a first responder and as a parent. Okay, and here's a quick story, expression of all of this. Is Zachary, we used to go to a Paradise Valley Mall in North Phoenix all the time. He loved to walk, just walk and walk and walk. But there used to be a store called Hot Topic, and he loved going in there. I don't know what it was with this store. It wasn't a store I would typically choose to go into, but he loved going in there, get the business cards, and just look and spend the lights and the colors. Well, we would go in there, and he would get obsessed with something. And we would try to redirect him. He'd want a certain object or a business card or something. And this one particular time he wanted this object. He wanted something, and we weren't going to buy it. We didn't have the resources to buy it. So we're trying to redirect, and finally he just dropped to the ground and just threw a fit, to say, just screaming, and just would not move. It got to the point where I physically had to pick him up and carry him out. And he just, you know how a lot of people do, when you go to pick them up, they just get extremely rigid. And that was what was going on. Well, we went back to the store the following week, and the same behavior occurred. We started realizing, okay, we got to, before we even get to the store, try to change his behavior to get the appropriate behavior in there. We were fortunate is that the store staff that worked there were very compliant and understanding, and they were supportive of trying to get a proper behavior. And it came down to, the whole problem was when Zachary went in there, he wanted a Hot Topic business card. That was it. If he didn't get the card, that when we got the behavior, we had the crisis. So it was learning his communication and what he needed and what he desired, and then us trying to provide that. And if he didn't get the card, he'd have a meltdown, got the card, and we're all happy. So that's my little story and what my personal experience. So next up, here's Frank.
Hi, here we go. Next steps. I've been asked to speak to how do we react to someone who might be threatening, and how do we actually know when someone is threatening? And actually, Ray and Christian spoke extensively to communication, and it's all about communication. The person will be communicating whether or not they're in a threatening manner, that they're presenting threatening. First thing we have to understand, everyone has a different level of different level of what is a threat. And we have to know where that level is. When do we feel safe? How do we feel safe? And of course, in a changing environment, it's really important. We have a diverse group. I was watching the chat room. We have a diverse group of folks from community organizations, law enforcement. We have some state organizations. We have folks who work with folks. And that's important because, as Christian mentioned earlier, anybody can find themselves in a behavioral health crisis, and then we have to know when can we assist them. If that person approaches your level, I have to put this on the first slide, is you simply call 911. If you feel threatened, you know that your level has been approached, you call 911. So communication, that is how we know. The same way that we communicate effectively, and how the words that we use, the tone that we use those words, and oh. I'm sorry, here I am. I just realized I didn't have a webcam, but hopefully you heard my audio. Our words used, the tone we use those words, and of course, how our body language associated with that. Researchers say 60 to 80% of all of our communication is through our body language. And the words we use and the tone we use, they all have to be together. They have to be congruent for us to be able to communicate. If you go home today and someone said, hey, how was that webinar? And you say to them, oh, it was just freaking awesome. Well, obviously you're not communicating that it was awesome, correct? Well, so we'll apply the same thing to folks who might be threatening you. And what are the words that they're using? Are they obvious threats of harm? Are they saying, I'm going to hurt you, I'm going to kill you? Very, very important. Ask a question. Are you thinking of killing yourself? Are you thinking of suicide? Maybe even when a person, maybe that's an early question to ask. It's a very difficult question to ask. Folks actually have to be taught how to ask that question. Most folks want to say, are you going to harm yourself? And that is not necessarily, it doesn't apply to suicide, of course. And you want to know how that person is going to kill themselves as well, because you're assessing a threat level. If they're going to use a weapon, we're going to get into it a little later, but it's really very simple response. Are you thinking about harming others? Are you afraid? Folks who are in a crisis are afraid. By the very definition of crisis, people who are feeling afraid when they're expressing themselves, they're in a crisis, they're almost in survival mode. Everything feels like a threat to them. So they might be threatening to protect themselves. Always be patient for the answer. No matter the behavioral health crisis, the mental illness, the developmental disability, when someone is in a crisis, there is a processing delay and there's processing problems. And we just have to wait for an answer. We always have to respect that processing time. There we go. Talked about words. Well, how do we use those words? And how does the person who we might feel threatened by using the words? Well, that's tone. And we know what an angry tone is. Someone is agitated, someone is angry. We know when someone is tired, right? We know what that sounds like because we've all been there ourselves. Apply whatever you feel yourself and how you communicate when you're feeling tired, when you're feeling frustrated, when you're feeling frightened. As adults, we probably feel frightened less than when we were younger, but there are times we feel frightened by what's going on in our environment. And what's the body language? There's some obvious ones, right? Of course, clenched fists. If someone is actually charging at you, this is very obvious. But watch the body language. Is it a threatening, hovering over body language? But there has to be a disclaimer that remember this person is in crisis. A developmental disability could absolutely present itself as a threat. So that's when you have to figure out, when do you call 911 or when do you call crisis? Well, I would still apply what I said earlier. And when a person is crisis presented, any behavior that's above your skill level to deal with, to handle, to work with, to de-escalate. De-escalating is so important. If you cannot bring your own calm to the environment, to the situation, to the incident, then your chaos will be contagious. Chaos and calm are both contagious. You have to feel safe. If you feel safe, then a crisis team can come. Crisis teams are not armed. When they arrive, there will be two folks. One will be a behavioral health professional, one will be a behavioral technician, and they are not armed. And they are there to help de-escalate. They are help to work with the person. They are there to help them community stabilize, bring them to the next level of care, or possibly or stabilize them right in their home. And they do this really, really well, by the way, as well. Highly encourage you to call a crisis team. It's okay to punt. It's always okay to punt. There's a reason it's in the NFL. Just punt and then get the ball back some other time. In this case, you're giving it to professionals who are a third party who don't have any previous contact with the person, and oftentimes it's easier when you bring someone else in from the outside. And it's really easy to get in touch with our crisis teams. You simply call the crisis hotline, and you describe what's going on with you, and they will triage it and determine whether or not you need to receive a crisis team. And the number is simple. It's 602-222-9444, and it's there on the bottom of your screen. So when do you call 911? This is actually pretty simple, if you ask me. I know where my level is. The diverse group of people will have a different level of when they're going to call 911, probably, or when they're going to call a crisis line. But there are some bright lines. There are some absolutes. Obviously, when you feel danger, bottom line, if you feel you're in danger, you call 911. If you don't feel safe, call 911. You can't call a crisis team into your situation if you don't feel safe. That's not fair to them. If there's a weapon present, this is super easy. I don't care if remember, a knife is a weapon. If someone has a knife, clearly a gun, that is not a situation that you should be dealing with. If someone is threatening themselves with a weapon, absolutely call 911. The police do this well. Police are highly trained, and yes, some police do make mistakes and they don't do this well. But for the most part, after 25 years of spending in the police department in training folks in hostage negotiations and crisis negotiations and crisis intervention, I can tell you the police actually do a very, very good job of de-escalation, and they know the resources that they can bring that person to or bring the resources in. And that's all I have. Sarah?
Awesome. Thank you very much, Frank. Sarah just went offline for a second. We're trying to troubleshoot her back into the webinar. So what I can do from here is that we can open up the chat pod to questions. I have a couple already in the queue. One was answered within the comments. It was crisis intervention techniques, and that was answered by Justin. It was Lindsay's question. But prior to that, Lindsay had a question. What if the individual is nonverbal? And I'm not sure, Lindsay, which presenter was presenting when you asked that question, but if you could type in the comment area, I'd love to forward that question to them. Looks like we have multiple attendees typing. We'll wait for those questions, and thank you, presenters, for coming up on your webcam. Lindsay says, hi, there was just talk about communication, so what about those individuals who are nonverbal? And I guess it could apply to each one of you, so if any one of the presenters want to take on that question, that'd be great.
I'll jump in. This is Ray. It's like Frank was saying, 60% of our communication is nonverbal. It's our body language. So with an individual that is nonverbal, like my son Zachary's nonverbal, he doesn't articulate sentences, basic words, a lot of it's just my demeanor and your demeanor of how you approach them and how if you're frustrated and anxious, the other individual is going to naturally pick it up. So especially individuals with developmental intellectual disabilities, they're going to pick that cue up real quick. So you got to learn to keep your emotions in check and your frustrations in check to help guide the conversation though it's without words, to learn a behavior and to get the behavior you're looking after. So a lot of times is just with, a touch, hand feeling. A lot of times facial cue cards with facial expressions and expressing pain, anger, frustration, using those prompts to help the individual articulate what they're feeling, because that's the biggest thing, is getting those emotions out and talking about them. And then that builds connection with whoever the receiver of that message is, and it helps establish the relationship. So to me, it's a lot of nonverbal communication takes place, and just getting them to how to identify and express their emotion.
Excellent. Thank you, Ray. Any other comments from Frank or Christian on that question? No? All right. Let me just go down the queue here. We have a comment. I'm not sure how to approach this, Margarita. Margarita comments, my concern is when my son says, maybe I will kill myself. This is when he is frustrated or does not get his way. Wondering if any of the presenters would like to say something about that.
Yeah, I'll definitely cover that. And this is what when we train police officers in the crisis intervention team training, when children are especially your own child, it can be very difficult to communicate with your own child when they're in crisis. Well, that's a great call for the crisis mobile team. There you have the two professionals that are going to come out, and oftentimes you're the one, and you don't even realize it, who really needs the crisis team. You're at your wit's end. You're done. You're toast. That's just the realities of being a caregiver. Bring someone else in. It's okay. I would also make a safe environment. Find out, obviously take any weapons out of the house that might be there if he's continually threatens. Even knives, remember, every single home has weapons, even if you don't really think about it, because there's knives in the kitchen. So make a safe environment and call for mobile teams if you don't know what to do. Again, punt. If it gets above your skill level, even if it's with your own kids, look, there aren't a lot of manuals on how to speak to children who are in a crisis. So feel free to use especially Maricopa County. I did see one question earlier that asked, is that crisis line just for Phoenix? And actually, it's just for Maricopa County, not the entire state. However, there are mobile teams, crisis mobile teams in other areas as well. I apologize, I don't know those phone numbers. And that's it. That's all I would have for that answer.
Thank you, Frank. We're going to move down to Lindsay's comment question. She states techniques are done, prompts are given, directions, but there's no response from the individual in crisis. So what do you do?
This is Ray. There's always something that's said with the body language, the mannerisms of, it may not be verbal words, and sometimes you got to start there and build on those prompts. Sometimes just sitting with the person, not even saying anything, just sitting there in their world with them helps to start establishing a relationship for communication. It's just being there. So as long as there's no harm, nobody's physically being harmed, sometimes you do that. Well, I've done that with my sons in stores, and sometimes it's just stop. We're just going to sit here, let him, he needs to work through his process, his emotions, and then we can move forward.
Yes, I agree with what Ray's saying, and I would just add that sometimes we have to realize there is no time limit on managing a crisis or responding to a person in crisis. So it's really important to allow that person, as Ray's saying, that time, and just realizing that if you just kind of sit back, as Ray's saying sometimes, and just be there, and if there's no threat, as Frank has mentioned, then sometimes just giving a little bit more time, the person themselves can learn a clue, and you might discover a little bit more of what's going on with that individual.
Thank you, Christian. down in the comments. I'll read Shirley's out loud. It says, thank you, Frank. The watching of body language will help when assisting with nonverbal students, watching what may trigger a meltdown. And if we move a little bit further, Jen says, in our setting, we have to take threats to self seriously every time, and then it seems to snowball and become something new. Thoughts for bringing things back to a calm place.
Hi, it's Frank. Yeah, well, first of all, as I said, calm is contagious. As soon as we can bring anything calm, no matter what resources we're going to bring in to help us, if we can be calm, if we can remove distractions, loud noise. One of the things we train police on is turn your radio down if it's safe. Do you have to have 5 officers in one room, all with their radios blaring? As a police officer, that's normal, and you forget. However, it's very agitating and it's escalating. So one of the best de-escalation techniques is to not escalate, and don't make it chaos. So speaking of escalation, does calling in resources when someone threatens themselves, is there escalation after that? Well, if the policy and procedure requires that you call when someone threatens, I would just fall back on that, and that's just the way it is. If you could streamline that, if it could be more objective, maybe there could be some better guidelines with when we actually call. But if there's a simple standard that you have to follow, then you just have to. So then you fall back on what I said in the beginning. Make the situation as calm as possible, so you don't have that. So at least you don't have the escalation.
That's right. I'll expand on that from the first responder fire side. Paramedic is we do the same thing, is watch the number of individuals that are around the person. A lot of times the more people get, the more anxiety rises, the more agitation the person's going to become. So we'll remove people, and we take safety first for ourselves and the individual, but sometimes just 2 or 3 other people stepping 5-10 feet away, just so there's a little more privacy for that individual for communication to help de-escalate it. Our goal is to maintain and then de-escalate. We don't want to increase it. So, and one of our first things we're going to do is scene safety. Then we're going to look to the caregiver there to find out what they've done and how the situation has been and what the typical behavior is of that individual, so we can get a baseline and then start working from there. And police and fire are getting more and more training on how to work with the DD population. I would love to see more, but we are getting more involved in it and getting better skills. So a lot of it's just working with your local first responders, inviting them to come out to see your facility, to learn about that population that you serve so they can respond more appropriately. And that starts with having a relationship with them. So I encourage you to reach out to your local first responders and share your community with them of what the environment.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Frank. Moving along, Ted Garland asks, how do we go about bringing law enforcement officers and first responders to deal with these unique behaviors?
It would be nice to have a little clarification for that. I think Ray mentioned it, and I've mentioned it. So how? I guess the best way to answer it is to give a quick agenda of how we provide the exposure in CIT class to the different populations. We start out the week very basic with psychological disorders, and then we immediately move into empathy. We have an exercise we call hearing voices, where the officers experience what it's like to have auditory hallucinations, and it's profound. We bring a family member in to begin to talk about what it's like to be a caregiver of someone who has a very serious illness. The following day, we bring in folks who are members of NAMI, the National Alliance for Mental Illness, where they actually talk about their lived experience. Oftentimes, that person will have had a police experience, and that's what we ask of all of our speakers, to have some sort of a police experience so that they can bring it back to the police officers. And again, these are all the individual populations that we work with. We also almost every single one of our instructors has had a lived experience and probably a police experience, because that's what we ask for. We cover developmental disabilities, autism especially. There's Alzheimer's that's covered, PTSD. PTSD from two approaches typically, one from a police officer who has developed PTSD over their career, and typically a returning vet as well. We cover addiction as a substance use disorder, in other words, mental illness, and that again builds empathy for those folks that the police officers deal with every single day out on the street, who are suffering from an addiction and who only look like the worst of society. Then we go into we talk about suicide extensively. We do that for our own population as well. The police officers, the number one killer of police officers are themselves. It's suicide. And of course, we talk about it in the empathy, and we dispel myths in the rest of the instruction. From there, we go to de-escalation and communication, and then we do scenarios. So we actually reinforce the information that we provided to police officers, because role play is the best way for training, and we reinforce everything that we taught in the different populations. So I would think in most of the folks also, well, they come from the community, they come from a community organization, they come from somewhere that's working with folks, or they have the lived experience. That's how we bring people in to speak to police officers. And we've been doing it for 15 years in Maricopa County, which is something to be proud of, by the way. That's rare. And we're currently doing 12 CIT trainings throughout the valley, training 360 officers every year now, which very, very few, and I'm going to say very, very few, but I can't think of anybody who's training that many police officers in the entire country. And as Ray said earlier, we are now working with Chandler Fire Department, and for the first time, we are developing a similar program specific for firefighters, because it's a really different world. People often lump firefighters and police into the same realm, and as Ray will say, it is actually very different. We're almost always on the same scene, but we're looking at the world very differently. And it's really important for firefighters to have a different viewpoint from which to teach and instruct and learn.
Thank you, Frank.
I echo what Frank said. The fire does come from a different perspective, but we're working with police, and the CIT guys are phenomenal out in the field, and they do an outstanding job. And on the fire side, we come in from the medical as paramedics and to treat the individual and take them to the appropriate facility. The paramedics do get training in school for mental health, and then we do have continuing education that goes on every 2 years. We have to have so many hours to maintain certification, and that is expanding because the behavioral health community is advocating for more training for first responders to be able to give more efficient, effective treatment. And that's only because it's enhancing because of the relationships that are being developed. So I encourage you to be involved with your local first responders, invite them to come over and see your facilities, get to know your community so they can know the norms of that community, and you start having relationships. That's the only way we're going to improve service.
Thank you. And I just want to say I very much enjoy the activity in the chat area. I'm going to try to cover everyone's questions and comments as best I possibly can. And if I ask a question twice because I'm not hearing the answer, my apologies. I'm trying to copy paste and do everything at the same time. But we'll just go right down. I know that Lindsay's question asking about cue cards and visuals was answered by Ray later in the chat. And he stated that they actually do have cue cards. Kelly comments that consideration could be a functional behavioral assessment, and it's a covered service and could help address behaviors. And finally, to Greg's question, are there any special hints for dealing with children in crisis, especially if other children are present, say in a school?
I'll comment on that. I work a lot with children as well as the geriatric population. There really isn't anything different on how a child may respond in crisis. It might be a little bit more behavioral, like nonverbal behaviors you'll notice when the child's in crisis versus actual verbal comments and words and things like that. But kids experience the same thing as adults when they go through crisis. When you're dealing with a child who's in, like, let's say, a classroom setting, the best thing to do is really to remove that child into, as we've mentioned a couple times, like a calm environment, a calm place, and a quiet setting. It's kind of like, if you think about it for yourself, if we are like overloaded and a lot of things are going on and we have so many different sensory things coming at us, it's hard to get a person to calm down. So if you can remove those distractions and those things from that child, it helps them really to kind of, you can better address the crisis the child experiencing. And it also helps keep the other children safe. So definitely taking that child, either removing the kids out of the classroom if you need to, or removing the child out of the classroom if they will go with you willingly, to a calm place where it doesn't appear to be like a disciplinary. I think that's really important to say. It's not about disciplining the child, but making them feel that they have a place they can go to calm down.
Thank you, Christian. Moving down the chat, Justin Harris has a resource. He states that DDD has prioritized outreach to first responders to present on working with people with DD, and he has reached out regarding presentations to many law enforcement and fire departments throughout Arizona. And he was wondering if those on the webinar have any ideas regarding other places where he could present this information.
We have, keep going back to CIT, but we do teach developmental disabilities and at CIT. However, what we all have is for lack of a better term, advanced CIT. We have a deeper look into the different mental health concerns, disorders that we present at CIT, and then some that we just simply don't have time to. And this is actually a great subject for advanced CIT. I don't know, I think maybe a webinar like this might be a great place for it as well. And here's another one. Every police department, and Ray mentioned fire as well, they have annual trainings. So I would approach the training officers for the police departments, and there's no one clearinghouse for it. However, Arizona Post would be the closest thing for a clearinghouse to approach with an instruction on developmental disabilities. They're a great place to start. Listen in the phone book and on the website, and then in cold calls to police departments, to their fire training, to their training officers who actually run the training department. And don't stop, because you might run into someone who's not answering their emails or their voicemail. A little heads up about police officers, sometimes they're not the best to get back to you.
Thank you, Frank. That is followed up by Shirley Cummings asking, is there a training offered to school employees on how to watch for these behaviors? One more time, Frank. I think it kind of hiccuped there a little bit.
Okay, probably kept it on. No, I don't know of any that is presented to specifically to schools. However, I would offer to help develop one. If there isn't one out there, I would say we probably do need one, and we should develop it.
Excellent. We had some back and forth between some participants about health services through DDD. Luis Ruiz shared ABC, which is antecedent behavior and consequence. If that's something that you'd like to search online, you can sort of see the details behind each one of those. Let's see. Kelly offers a resource, Health Choice Integrated Care Northern Arizona, and Gila Crisis Hotline, and you'll see the number up in the chat. We have a crisis network link. And here's Marlene. She states, one of the main challenges I encounter is when individuals with DD are being treated with medications for seizure control, but these meds affect the mental health status at the same time. The BH system and medical field does not appear sufficiently integrated. If any of the presenters want to chime in on that, please just come right in. I'm going to continue down. Elizabeth Lopez asks, does the ADDPC or IHD have any information on a geriatrician? I would have to look into that, Elizabeth. I'm going to queue your question up, and then hopefully we can get back to you with some information either from us or ADDPC. And Luis asks, does prevention and support training work for you guys? Staff and family need proper training and resources.
I'm going to jump in as Ray. A couple of questions I'm going to combine. One was regards to training for schools and stuff like that. I know some of the school districts, especially their special ed programs, have training that they provide to their teachers and the aides or assistants that are working in there. And then also, as a parent, when the IEPs are being developed for my son Zachary, we developed strategies for dealing with the behavior. So we were parents, we were part of that, finding a solution. Granted, we relied upon the schools because they were, we perceived as they're the professionals and know what's best, but it's also working with other providers to find out what's the correct tools and resources to provide Zachary with an environment where he can excel in without restricting him, but providing him an opportunity to learn and grow. So, I think that's one of the biggest things is just the parents and being engaged in the IEP process through the schools, which then carries over when they become an adult and they have an individual.
I would also like to add, it might be important for schools to consider when you are developing IEP programs and the kid has this SED diagnosis or emotional diagnosis, consider, or even intellectual diagnosis, to consider creating a crisis plan for that kid as part of their IEP service plan. And what that can do is really help if you know that child, and as you're developing it, can really help you be kind of looking for triggers for that particular child or student in that class if they know that. So if you can be more and develop that more in your IEP planning with your service plan, I think a crisis plan can be really effective, but helping just being aware of teacher and the team of the child, being aware of kind of what are some of those kids' triggers and things to look for so you can avoid those in his classroom setting or
And there's also, and Sarah, I'm going to rely on you, is our program through the council on positive behavioral.
Awesome, thank you. Go ahead, Sarah.
Hi, yes, just really briefly, we did fund a large project with PBIS, now headed by Jean Ajame, who is here on the webinar. Jean, maybe you can speak a little bit more about that in the chat box. And if people have questions about resources, they really drill in that ABC training, and they do so much more on a school-wide, district-wide basis at times. So Jean, feel free to jump in the chat box and share more about PBIS.
All right, thank you everyone. This chat box is really populating here, and I kind of foresee that we might run into a time limit, but we will keep track of everyone's questions and sort of come back to you if we don't reach them during this conversation part. I wanted to say that Sarah had answered Elizabeth's question for a geriatrician, and if you go to your local area agency on aging, you can look that up on the internet and maybe find some resources there. Let's see. Requesting an eval if you have a case manager from Lindsay. Lindsay asks, if the police have knowledge that the individual has autism, would they turn off their sirens and try to create the calm?
Well, that's quite the emergency call. Typically, the police aren't running their sirens. It's actually an unusual call to be running both their lights and sirens. That is done only when there is an emergency that requires it. Not even all emergencies require lights and siren. And I think all police departments have this. So there's an interlock when the police car goes into drive. When it goes into park from drive, the sirens shut off, and also oftentimes the front deck lights, the overhead lights, the red and blue lights, they will also shut off. So, and now obviously not every police car will have that across the state, but I think they all do locally. So I'm not sure where that question would be coming from, because they should be off once the officers arrive at the scene. Yeah, sirens are actually something that will they're quite annoying into the police officer. Once they get to the scene, it's very hard to do your job with the siren on. So typically they're turned off, even if you wouldn't have that mechanical interlock that turns off once you go into park. But yes, I would think clearly if police officers, if a parent, if a caregiver, or even a knowledgeable person realizes that a person has autism and they're being agitated by the sirens, I'm sure the police officers would turn them off if it's requested. Police officers don't know that the person has autism unless it was in the call for service. And I'm sure if that was in the call for service, please turn your sirens off as soon as you get to the scene. They would do that as well. Ask if they don't, is what I would say.
Yeah, also on the fire side is we're the ones that tend to drive with lights and sirens more than the police officers do. But when you yeah. And we can also control the intersection lights to give us the green. If when you make the call for a request, you call 911, let the dispatcher know the individual has whatever and is exasperated by the siren sound. And so as a first responder, we know that information so we can adjust accordingly. If it's safe and prudent to do, we'll turn it off before we get to the scene. Also, you can contact your local, here in the Phoenix Valley metro area and pretty much around the state, you can call your local first responders and self-disclose to them your access, functional need, disability, that they can input that information into the computer-aided dispatching system before a call is requested. So like at my house, the CAD system pulls up information about my son Zachary, so the firefighters coming to my house know about him before they even get there. So that's that part of building a relationship with your local first responders, because we want to do a great job. Frank and I want to do a great job, but it starts with knowing, having the information.
Thank you. I just have to say I loved seeing the chat area and all the participants being resources for everyone. So I wish the chat wasn't as linear as it is, that we have to go up and down and find all the answers to questions. So I'll continue down with some comments and questions. Lindsay stated, and I think we just heard that police and fire personnel having that understanding and awareness. Mary Kay states Graham County area resources, and I feel like it was answered down at the bottom. Elizabeth states something about statewide jurisdiction and be great to have one in Maricopa County. Lindsay states some cities are doing like a community spaghetti dinner. We've brought our son to meet police officers and for law enforcement to get to know our kiddo. That's great. Kathleen asks, how can we get the public educated in this arena of mental health and developmental disabilities? It is very difficult in a public situation where redirection and de-escalation in these individuals and the public putting in their 2 cents, in quotes, like spank their kid, etc.
Kath, I would just to address Kathleen's comment. I think a big part of, I think also what we're hoping to come out of this webinar is that, to see that community organizations are becoming empowered. And I think that, different organizations and individuals who live in the community can make the effort and also take that stance to try to set up meetings at, libraries or churches or community community centers, things like that, where you feel like you can bring people together who might be interested in those topics. And as Frank and Ray mentioned, and myself as well, I think there are a lot of people out there, professionals, and I'm seeing some of your resources listed, that will be willing to come and provide information to help train individuals in the community. So I think it's really about how do we collaborate all together and work to really address the needs of the community and not being afraid maybe to be the first person who opens that door. If it's something you see in your community that's needed, maybe organizing something at a school and in the evening or at the community center might be a way to get going and reaching out to some of the resources you have.
Thank you. Marlene asks the next question, are police officers aware of the danger of using tasers on individuals with DD, as many of the individuals have underlying medical conditions that make tasers more dangerous for them than normal?
I'll be honest, that's the first time I've heard that. So I would guess we don't, or they don't. I somehow we should probably include that into some sort of training. I don't remember that being covered in our teaser training. It's been 3 years since I've had any, so it could be incorporated today, but it's not incorporated into our CIT. If someone could turn me to some documentation that shows that, I would love to incorporate it into our training that we currently conduct.
Thank you, Frank. Lindsay continues with a resource. The Autism Society of Greater Phoenix is offering a screening of the Be Safe movie. There's a link a couple of comments down. Margarita asks, Frank, can anyone take those CIT classes? And how do we get the cost?
How do we get, what was the second part? Oh, how do we create content? Oh, that's a great question.
He's asking maybe how much
I'm reading a different
cost?
question. I'm sorry. What was the second part of the question? Oh, the cost. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Actually, CIT is very specific to police officers and actually patrol officers. So we actually ask that no detectives go. We want folks who are who will use it every day, who are working with the population every single day to attend the CIT training, because we have waiting lists to get in. We currently have waiting lists. We've had waiting lists for about a year now, since we expanded the programs. So it is very specific to police officers. It's behavioral health training for police officers is what CIT is. And I think your best crisis training, or at least awareness training that's out there, and there's mental health first aid, which has some great success attached to it. I think assist training is good, and that is open to the public. And within assist, there's Safe Talk. So there are a few out there that are open to the public. Those are the three off the top of my head that are. All of those do have a cost, and I'm sorry, I don't know what those cost. But they all have websites.
Thank you, Frank. I just want to announce that we're about 4 minutes away from the end of the webinar, and there's many comments and questions that we haven't covered yet. I think what we'll do post-webinar is sort of all the presenters and the host get together and figure out a way to maybe answer some of these questions, send out a document as a resource to everyone with an email for whoever participated. But I'm just going to kind of move down up until 3 minutes from now. And Megan asks, is the CIT mandatory for police or do departments opt in?
CIT is not mandatory in Arizona, although I don't know a police department is now participating, at least in Maricopa County, and most throughout the state as well. So absolutely throughout Maricopa County, every police department is participating. The goal of deployed CIT officers is about 20% of your patrol force. That is a number that sort of achieves having at least one CIT officer on every single squad. Some police departments are far above 20, and most are approaching 20 since the latest push in the best, well, really in the last 2 years since the expansion of the program. So.
Thank you. We have a link and a phone number for the Area Agency on Aging. Let's see here. Last question, moving down. Lindsay asks, if there are undesired behaviors happening in schools, in the school setting, then definitely an FBA should be conducted. What's done with that data is a whole story. Sometimes a better plan is put in place. Other times nothing is done and the child suffers. Sorry, I thought that was a question as more of a comment. Maybe this one could be the last question. If a member is enrolled with the behavioral health home, sorry, this might be a comment too, they should have a crisis plan written with a team to help address all of the crisis behaviors. And this is for real a question. Frank, can you send me the information on your training? I also agree Arizona Post is a great place to start. That being said, we're about 1 minute out. I'm going to hand this over to Sarah, but I'm going to say thank you to the presenters. Please, I'll leave the platform open for a little bit. If you have other questions that you want to ask, place them in the chat area and we will collect them all and move them forward. Thank you.
Well, everyone, I want to thank you for joining us today, and I want to thank our presenters, Christian, Ray, and Frank. I will tell you, this is the most interaction I believe we've ever had on one of our ADDPC webinars, and I'm thrilled to be able to partner with the Mayor's Commission. Thank you, Christian, for forging that partnership. Also want to thank Peter Fisher and the entire commission for approving that. Keep talking to each other. I think we're going to keep the platform up for a while. I love seeing all of these emails exchanged and phone number and online resources. We will definitely be sending out a recorded version of this webinar today. We'll also send out links to some of the resources discussed so that, again, you can share with your colleagues and pass along to people that you believe will be able to learn some of these techniques when it comes to CIT and crisis response in different organizations or in our communities. I also want to thank people who are from some of the more rural areas of our state. I'm thrilled to see we have a wide swath of people, yes, in Phoenix and Tucson, but also Mojave County and Graham County and Flagstaff, and I love it. That's what we want to aim for. So please reach out to us here at the Council if you have any follow-up questions, ideas for more webinars, or other crisis intervention related topics that you think we should cover. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Hi, Teresa. If you can hear me, in the lower left pod, there's a PDF for download, and that is for copy of the slides for the webinar. So you can download it there. If you do hear me, could you put something in the chat area? Thank you. Thank you, Jacqueline. Yes, please click on the name of the file, and then you can hit the download button. It'll show up on the bottom there. Thanks, Jacqueline.